They say the dead don't whisper, but if you stand beneath the cold floorboards of the Church of the Pure Spirit, where the air hangs thick with centuries of silence, you might hear them. Not words, just breath, like someone gasping for salvation long after the soul has fled. There are places in this world where history refuses to die, where the sins of the past are not buried but preserved, encased in ritual and bone, waiting for someone, like you, to dig too deep. This is not a story. It is a key, a descent, a calling. In the forested isolation of upstate New York, buried beneath the sermons of false prophets and forgotten revivals, lie 143 unmarked graves, and a family whose name was almost erased from history. Almost. The Ravencroft brothers. To the faithful, they were messengers of divine purification. To the forgotten dead, they were architects of torment. Ezra, Silas, Caleb. 3 men cloaked in scripture, veiled in charisma, and driven by something far darker than faith. For decades, they turned their followers into vessels, bodies broken in the name of spiritual fire. And while history buried their crimes beneath layers of respectability, sealed files, and federal silence, something remained. Now, I need you to understand this. What you're about to hear wasn't meant for you. The Ravencrofts didn't write for posterity. They wrote for power, for control, for the chosen few. You were never supposed to know how their church used ritual suffering to sculpt obedience, how pain became sacrament, how belief was weaponized into something far more terrifying than madness, willing submission. Their church wasn't just a cult, it was a prototype. And what they perfected behind those cold stone walls would echo through time, disguised in different robes, wrapped in new ideologies, but always serving the same purpose, to hollow you out and make you useful. This descent we're taking together isn't just into a family's dark legacy, it's into a system that didn't die with them. It evolved, sharpened, expanded, and it's still here. You felt it, haven't you? In the silence behind a politician's smile, in the unease of a televised sermon, in the strange peace that comes from surrendering your pain to someone who promises to fix you. Stay with me. The deeper we go, the harder it will be to turn back. But that's the point. The surface is where they want you. We're not staying there. Ravenwood was never meant to be remembered. A forgotten patch of earth in the hills of New York, so ordinary, so small, it vanished from most maps before the Civil War ended. But in 1825, when the Ravencroft brothers arrived, something changed. The land darkened. Ezra, the eldest, walked with the presence of a general and the voice of a prophet. His sermons weren't just spoken, they pierced. Men who doubted their faith for decades wept at his feet. Silas, the scholar, wielded scripture like a scalpel, precise, cold, and sharp enough to bleed truth from metaphor. And Caleb didn't speak much, but when he did, it was with whispers that carved their way into your spine. Together, they purchased 30 acres on the outskirts of Ravenwood. And then, they built the Church of the Pure Spirit. Not a house of worship, a fortress. No windows, no bell, no light save for flame. It rose from black stone carved from the hills like a monument to silence itself. Inside, the sanctuary was octagonal, a shape of ancient power, not Christian tradition. And at the center of it all, a floor engraved with a spiral so massive it consumed the eye. They said it symbolized the soul's path toward God. But those who stood upon it claimed to feel watched. The town watched with curiosity at first. A new church wasn't unusual. The Second Great Awakening had turned upstate New York into a battlefield of preachers. But the Ravencrofts were different. They weren't asking for faith. They were demanding surrender. And people gave it. Because suffering speaks a universal language. The broken came first. The grieving, the lost, the shamed. People who had nothing left to live for found a kind of brutal comfort in the Ravencroft's message. That pain had purpose. That trauma was a test. That through agony, the soul could be cleansed and reforged. But this wasn't healing. It was grooming. They didn't break people all at once. They did it slowly. Prayer vigils became sleep deprivation. Cold baptisms became hypothermia. Fasting became starvation. Every new ritual went deeper, and the congregation didn't rebel. They thanked them. Because once you believe that your suffering is sacred, you'll do anything to suffer more. The Ravencroft didn't just preach purification, they designed it. They engineered pain into a ladder and convinced their followers to climb it blind. And when the first bodies disappeared, no one asked where they went, because the dead don't need to be buried. When you've already buried your doubt. December 21st, 1829. The longest night of the year. They called it the First Ascension. But it wasn't salvation. It was a message, etched in bone and ritual, that the Ravencroft had crossed a line from doctrine into domination. By then, their followers numbered over 150. Many had surrendered homes, wealth, even children to the Church of the Pure Spirit. But no one expected what would unfold that night beneath candlelight and carved stone. Prophet Caleb claimed to have received a vision from the divine mouth, a force beyond angels, beyond even God, which demanded proof, not of belief, but of obedience. And so, Ezra summoned the congregation. No heat, no windows, just the stone sanctuary lit by 12 massive candles arranged like spokes of a wheel. At the center, a raised platform etched with blood-colored spirals. 3 names were spoken: Sarah Pembroke, Michael Collins, Rebecca Winters. New converts, idealists, each broken by life and reborn under the Ravencroft's care. Caleb announced that they had been chosen for elevation. Not death, he insisted, but transfiguration. They were led to the platform, stripped, bound to inverted crosses. And then 7 trials began. 7, not for heaven, 7 for control. Trial 1, breath. Wet cloths, soaked, pressed to their faces. Water poured until the lungs screamed for air, but no release came. Trial 2, earth. Soil from sacred ground packed tight around their bodies. Buried standing, left until the pulse slowed, then yanked from the brink. Trial 3, fire. Heated iron rods touched to skin, not to kill, just to mark. Symbols, Caleb said, gateways for the spirit to enter. Trial 4, water again, but colder. Icy barrels, submersion after submersion, shocks to the system. And then it grew worse. Hartford, one of the few who escaped, said he vomited at what came next. The trial of mirrors, forcing victims to stare into distorted reflections of themselves as their pain was read aloud like confessions. The trial of tongues, where they were made to scream their greatest secrets while the congregation chanted praise. And finally, the trial of silence. 3 hours. No sound, just the rustling of robes and the slow cracking of spirits. And then, Caleb touched their heads. He whispered something. No one could decipher it. And one by one, their backs arched. Bones snapped, eyes rolled white. They spoke in a language no one could translate. Then they died. Ezra declared them ascended. Their corpses, left on stone altars, worshipped death not as tragedy, but as triumph. And this was just the beginning. The morning after the first ascension, something changed in Ravenwood. Not outwardly, no fires, no screams, no panic. No, what changed was deeper, quieter, the kind of shift that happens when a line is crossed and no one resists it. The church's doors reopened at dawn. Ezra led a silent procession into the chamber below. There, on the cold stone slabs, lay the 3 ascended followers, pale, contorted, eyes frozen in a kind of permanent terror that the Ravencrofts called ecstasy. They didn't bury them, they preserved them. Their skin was treated with strange chemicals. Their limbs were arranged into poses of worship. Their mouths were stitched closed, not in disrespect, but to hold the sacred breath. And then they were displayed like relics, not hidden, not ashamed, honored. The congregation was told to kneel before them, to whisper prayers for similar suffering, And it worked, because by then, pain had become a currency, and the Ravencroft were printing it like scripture. The ones who stayed, they didn't just accept it, they craved it. Men who once begged for mercy now begged for trials. Women offered their children for light fasting and exposure to truth. One follower, Isaiah Black, volunteered to be blinded, claiming the Spirit told him he had seen too much of the world, and the Ravencroft let him, praised him, fed him from a silver bowl that night. But don't think this was chaos. That's the terrifying part. It was organized, structured, engineered. Deacon Silas kept meticulous records, pain thresholds, duration of screams, confessions extracted. He had a ledger of every member's trials, a psychological dossier dressed in religious language, not for faith, for control. And behind the rituals, behind the robes, behind every candle-lit hymn, was a single design, to hollow out the will. Because once you lose the ability to say no for your mind accepts that suffering is sacred, there's nothing left to protect you, no instinct, no resistance, just obedience in the shape of devotion. You're not a person anymore. You're a vessel. That word, vessel, they used it constantly. It sounds holy. It isn't. It means empty, replaceable, a shell to be filled with their gospel. And the gospel was pain. But here's the part no one understood until it was too late. The Ravencroft weren't just building a cult. They were building a model, a method, a framework for total human submission, and they were perfecting it under the guise of worship. By 1831, the Ravencroft had transformed their church into something that no longer resembled religion, not even cult. What stood in Ravenwood was an incubator for a deeper idea, something older, colder, and far more calculated than faith. They called it the ladder. A system of spiritual advancement through suffering, yes, but more than that, it was a hierarchy of submission. At the base were the supplicants, new recruits, often desperate, broken, or isolated. Their role was obedience, service, silence. They wore grey robes and were forbidden from speaking unless spoken to. Their trials were light, cold water, sleep deprivation, starvation masquerading as fasting. Then came the vessels, those who had proven their devotion through minor trials. They wore deep blue and were permitted to assist in rituals, even supervise new recruits. They were trusted, but only because they had been fully broken. Many were former professionals, school teachers, bankers, even a judge from Albany. Now, they begged for the right to bleed. Above them were the shepherds, selected by Prophet Caleb himself. They wore black and red. Their tasks included recruitment, punishment, and spiritual discernment. They could speak the doctrine of pain, lead trial chambers, administer tests, and yes, choose who would die next. Only one rank stood above them all, the chosen hollow. There were 6, handpicked by the Ravencroft, starved, tortured, emptied of all ego, then kept in near total isolation for months at a time. When they emerged, they were not human in the traditional sense. They were ceremonial instruments, living relics. One hollow was known only as Brother with No Tongue. His mouth had been sewn shut years before, after he bit off his own tongue during a vision. He became the silent executioner. It was said that to be chosen by him was an honor, that when he touched your shoulder during a sermon, it meant the Spirit had spoken. But make no mistake, this was not divine. It was design. Each tier of the ladder served a psychological function. Supplicants feared the vessels. Vessels envied the shepherds. Shepherds worshipped the hollows. And the hollows obeyed without question. This hierarchy wasn't just about control. It was a mirror of systems still used today. Corporations, religious institutions, military cults of personality, every level demanding loyalty to the level above, every level terrified of falling, every level protecting the few at the top. The Ravencroft didn't invent domination. They reverse-engineered it. From ancient texts, from esoteric symbols, from a knowledge that predates Christianity by centuries, and they embedded it in ritual so no one would question it, because when a man believes he's ascending, he doesn't notice he's already buried. Now we go beneath the church, deeper than stone, deeper than silence, into the catacombs. By 1833, the Ravencrofts had completed what they called the Veins of God, a vast underground network carved by hand and ritual, hidden beneath the Church of the Pure Spirit. But this wasn't a crypt, it wasn't storage, it was the nervous system of something monstrous. 7 chambers, 7 purposes, 7 layers of transformation. The chamber of preparation was first, dim, damp, no sound but breath. Here, candidates for elevation were kept in total isolation, no food, no light, no contact, just a small mirror, etched with scripture and framed in thorns. They were told to gaze into it until they saw themselves vanish. Most lasted 3 days, some broke within hours. Then came the chamber of trials, stone walls soaked in old blood, ropes hung like veins from the ceiling, implements of metal and fire laid out on wooden tables like surgical instruments. This is where the 7 trials were carried out, with brutal precision and religious fanfare. But the worst came after. The Chamber of Echoes, a circular room designed to reflect sound endlessly. Those who survived the trials were brought here and told to scream their truths. The walls magnified every cry, every sob, every whispered confession, bouncing it back tenfold until the pain became a chorus of self-destruction. It broke minds. That was the point. After that, the Chamber of Cleansing, where bodies were scrubbed, shaved, and anointed in oils, said to numb the mortal tether. But those oils contained hallucinogens, powerful ones. Silas sourced them from rare plants known only to folk healers and apothecaries with no name. And now, the Chamber of Ascension. Stone slab, a ceiling etched with the spiral, a hole directly above where the Ravencrofts would lean down to whisper the breath of flame into the ears of the dying. No one ever survived this room. That wasn't the goal. Death wasn't an end, it was a sacrament. The bodies were moved next door, to the Chamber of Saints. Here, the dead were arranged, some preserved in wax, some bound with wire, faces painted, hands in prayer, all displayed under candlelight as if still watching, still judging, still waiting, and finally, the deepest point, the Chamber of Silence. No one spoke here, no one moved. Only the Ravencrofts were allowed to enter. Elizabeth Carver, one of the few who escaped, later said this room wasn't for ritual, it was for communion, but not with God, with something else, something ancient. And in that silence, she said, it answered back, let's talk about what the Ravencrofts really believed. Because while their sermons echoed with scripture and their rituals mimicked Christianity, their core doctrine came from somewhere far older and far darker. They didn't worship God. They worshipped absence. They called it the hollow flame. Not a being, not a spirit, a force. A divine hunger that devours ego, identity, will. They taught that this force predated creation, that before the light, before the word, there was only the hollow flame, and that all life must return to it. Heaven, a lie for the weak. Salvation, a distraction. True purity, they said, came not from love, but from annihilation. The Ravencrofts didn't ask their followers to love the flame, they asked them to become it, to erase everything they were, and in doing so, become divine. This wasn't metaphor, this wasn't poetry, it was a blueprint for psychological destruction. Caleb often whispered during private sessions, "You are not who you think you are. That was given to you, built by others. Break it, burn it, become worthy." Think about that. How many times have you heard a version of it today? You're not enough until you fix yourself. You have to suffer to grow. Give up your will and follow the system. Modern self-help, military indoctrination, radical religion, corporate loyalty, they all echo this core idea. Your identity is a flaw, and we will fix you. But the Ravencrofts took it further. They broke you so deeply that by the end, you thanked them. Because when you're emptied out, stripped of self and given a new identity, a holy identity, it feels like rebirth. It feels like power. But it's not yours. It never was. You didn't ascend. You disappeared. And in that hollow shell they placed their flame, their agenda, their control. That's how they turned suffering into a weapon and obedience into worship. Because once you believe your pain is sacred, you'll do anything to protect it, even kill for it, even die for it. That's the truth they knew. That's the truth hidden in every cult, every system, every institution that demands your loyalty in exchange for purpose. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. You feel it behind the sermon, behind the slogan, behind the screen. A whisper, you are broken, but we will make you holy. That's not salvation, that's submission. By 1835, the Ravencroft weren't just running a cult, they were running a machine, a factory of transformation that consumed souls and produced obedience. From the outside, the church looked charitable. They hosted public festivals, donated to orphanages, even fed the poor. Ravenwood's mayor once described Elder Ezra as a man of vision with a heart for the broken. But inside the compound, behind locked doors and beneath candlelit corridors, something far more calculated was underway. They had begun collecting secrets. Every follower was required to confess daily, but not to God, not to prayer, to Deacon Silas. He recorded everything. What they feared, what they regretted, who they loved, who they hated. He turned those secrets into control. Like strings tied to the psyche, each confession bound the follower more tightly to the church. Silas called it spiritual leverage, but we know what it really was: psychological blackmail. Elizabeth Carver, whose journals were later found in a sealed box buried beneath a root cellar, wrote that Silas once confronted her with a confession she made 2 years earlier, that she had doubted Prophet Caleb during a ritual. She hadn't spoken it aloud. She had written it down in a prayer journal, a private one. They'd read it. Silas simply said, "We read everything, even the things you forget you've written." That's how deep their surveillance went. They weren't just controlling behavior, they were colonizing thought. And if you're thinking, that would never happen to me, understand this. The people who joined the Church of the Pure Spirit weren't fools. They weren't weak. They were desperate for meaning. And the Ravencroft offered them something most people spend their whole lives craving: certainty, purpose, a path. And once they were inside, the cost of leaving became higher than staying. Because to leave meant losing your status, your community, your identity. To leave meant facing the truth that you had been used, broken, rewritten. So they stayed, even as the rituals became bloodier, even as more ascensions were held, even as friends disappeared into the catacombs and never returned. Because here's the thing most people don't understand about control: it doesn't require chains. It just requires a lie you're too afraid to stop believing. And the Ravencroft, they knew exactly which lies men were built to kneel before. There's something most people miss when studying cults, secret orders, or so-called fringe religions. They don't stay fringe, not if they're effective, not if they're useful. By the late 1830s, the Ravencroft were no longer isolated preachers in a forgotten town. They had visitors, men in suits from New York City, professors from Yale and Columbia, even military officers from Washington. They didn't attend sermons, they didn't stay long, but they met with Caleb, always behind closed doors. Then the church suddenly received land grants, money, legal protection, and silence from law enforcement, despite over 22 recorded disappearances from Ravenwood in just 5 years. Why? Because the Ravencroft weren't just offering salvation anymore. They were offering a method. A tested, brutal, effective system for mass compliance. The same ladder of obedience that broke people into usable tools. The same rituals that erased the self and replaced it with loyalty. The same doctrine that transformed human suffering into fuel for structure. It wasn't religion. It was psychological engineering. and those in power. They saw the value. Ezra even wrote in a now classified letter, partially leaked during the Rayner hearings of 1947. They do not need to believe, only to obey. Faith is optional, structure is not. That line alone got the attention of federal observers, but nothing was done. Because by that time, the methods of the Ravencroft had already been quietly borrowed, integrated into military conditioning programs, educational obedience models, and early prototypes of psychological warfare. Silas, it turns out, kept meticulous records of which rituals produced the greatest fear to obedience ratio. He even mapped trauma response to certain phrases, what we now call neuro-linguistic programming, NLP. Sound familiar? It should. Because, well, it started in a candlelit chapel. Now echoes in boardrooms, in algorithms, in classrooms, in curated advertisements that prey on your fears, whispering that you are not enough until you buy, click, obey. The Ravencroft were never just prophets, they were prototypes. And what they built, the ladder, the veins, the flame, wasn't buried, it was scaled. Remember this, the most dangerous cults don't wear robes. They wear badges, suits, lab coats, and they don't call themselves churches anymore. They call themselves systems. By 1839, whispers began to spread beyond Ravenwood. Something wasn't right in Duskmoor Valley. A local boy had vanished after attending a day of reflection at the church. His parents were told he'd never arrived, but his shoes, mud-covered and marked with candle wax, were found near the eastern gate. 2 farmers went missing weeks later, a widow from Wren's Hollow, a traveling preacher. The town constable attempted an investigation. He disappeared too. And yet, no warrants were issued, no searches conducted. The mayor said the Ravencroft were integral to the community. The local press buried the stories, and the state police, they never even showed up. Because by this point, the Ravencroft didn't just influence Ravenwood, they owned it. Economically, politically, spiritually. They controlled land, banks, schools, even the hospital. Every institution was quietly linked to them by board members, donors, or marriages. This wasn't just a church, it was a shadow government. And what they were building beneath Ravenwood was expanding. Tunnels now stretched beyond the chapel, reaching under homes, farms, and into the roots of the forest. New chambers were being carved, not by followers, but by contracted laborers. People brought in from other towns, paid in cash, told they were helping construct a sanctuary for the broken. None of them were seen again. Elizabeth Carver's final journal entry, dated June 14, 1839, reads, "They've begun something, a chamber with no floor, just a hole, deep, alive. It hums when the children sing. I heard my name in it, but it wasn't my voice." It would be the last thing she ever wrote, because after that night, the Carver house was burned to the ground. Her body was never found. But here's what's more disturbing. Within a week, her journal was recovered. Not by police, not by her family, by Shepherd Josiah, one of the highest-ranking members of the ladder. And it was rewritten, pages added, the contents altered. What had been a record of abuse and warning became a testimony of redemption. A final blessing. This forged version was read aloud at Sunday Mass as proof of faith's triumph. No one questioned it. No one even blinked. Because by then the people weren't living in a town anymore. They were living inside a lie. A perfectly crafted one. One where the truth was edited, where history was sculpted, where the dead didn't speak unless given a script. And if you think that's just a story from a forgotten valley, look around you. How much of what you believe was handed to you, edited for your comfort, polished for your trust. The Ravencroft understood something most empires do. Whoever controls the story controls the soul, and in Ravenwood, they were the only ones telling it. The most chilling part of the Ravencroft's control wasn't just the physical torment, it was what they did to minds, especially the youngest. By 1840, children born into the Church of the Pure Spirit were no longer seen as innocents. They were blank slates. From birth, These children were separated from their parents, not as punishment, but as a ritual of purification. They were raised in the nursery of silence, a chamber deep within the catacombs, where light was scarce and sounds were muted. Here, speech was forbidden, emotion was suppressed, movement was regulated. These children learned obedience before language. By age 5, they underwent the trial of the veil, a ceremony where their eyes were covered with black cloth, symbolizing the stripping away of worldly vision. At 7, they were introduced to the Chamber of Whispers, a place where echoes distorted their understanding of reality. Here, elders recited doctrine in hypnotic tones, drilling obedience into the very fabric of their consciousness. By 10, many were selected to become vessels in training, receiving early exposure to fasting, isolation, and pain rituals under strict supervision. One surviving account, smuggled out by a defector decades later, describes a child named Lydia who, at 12, endured the trial of fire, where her skin was branded with symbols meant to ignite the hollow flame. She survived, barely, but she was never the same. Her whispered confessions became scripture for the elders, her broken spirit a tool to intimidate others. And this is the insidious nature of the Ravencroft's legacy. They didn't just capture adults desperate for meaning. They kidnapped innocence, rewrote childhood, and weaponized it. Children born into their grip didn't stand a chance, molded into vessels of compliance long before they understood who they were. This wasn't just psychological control, it was systematic obliteration of self, a perfect blend of trauma and doctrine engineered to erase identity and build absolute obedience, and it's a blueprint that haunts us still. Because systems like this don't vanish with time, they evolve, they adapt, and they hide in plain sight. So when you see a child trained to obey without question, to suffer without complaint, to sacrifice without understanding, remember, that is no accident. That is a lesson from Duskmoor. Shout it in the comments twice now. The hollow flame consumes the false self. The hollow flame consumes the false self. Let that phrase sink in. Lock it in. Because once you accept this truth, you begin the real transformation. You begin to see beyond the veil. Now that you've spoken the words, let's push further into the heart of darkness. The Church of the Pure Spirit wasn't just a place of secret torture and ritual sacrifice. It was a laboratory for psychological control that anticipated modern methods decades before their time. Deacon Silas, the scholar brother, was an obsessive experimenter. He combined ancient mysticism with emerging 19th century sciences, phrenology, mesmerism, even early psychology. He believed the mind was the final frontier of purification, that breaking the will was just the first step toward ultimate submission. This is where the real horror takes root. Silas developed what he called the spiral method, a relentless cycle of indoctrination designed to erode identity piece by piece. First, confusion. He flooded the congregation with contradictory teachings, promises of salvation followed by threats of eternal damnation, compassion intertwined with cruelty, light followed by darkness. This cognitive dissonance shattered mental defenses. Second, isolation. Members were cut off from outside influence, their communication monitored and censored. Trust was limited to the Ravencroft brothers and their inner circle. The world beyond the church became a distant nightmare. Third, dependence. Daily rituals, constant surveillance, and physical deprivation created a state of learned helplessness. Followers no longer believed they could survive without the church's structure, even if it meant death. And finally, surrender. Through repetitive chants, confession sessions, and ritual pain, individuals relinquished their selfhood. Their memories, doubts, and desires faded into a fog of obedience. This method wasn't invented in a vacuum. It mirrored and perhaps inspired later systems of control used in totalitarian regimes, cults, and even corporate environments that demand unwavering loyalty. The spiral method is still at work today in subtle forms, cloaked in motivational speeches and corporate mantras. When you hear phrases like, "trust the process," or "embrace the grind," recognize the shadow of this ancient blueprint. It's a trap disguised as empowerment, but knowledge is power. Understanding this cycle lets you recognize it before you fall deeper. Because once you see the spiral, you can break the pattern and reclaim what the hollow flame tried to consume. The Ravencroft's darkest secret was not just the physical or psychological torment, but their true purpose. Because beneath their veneer of religious fervor and twisted salvation, they were part of something far greater, a shadow network reaching beyond Ravenwood, beyond New York, beyond even the United States. Documents discovered nearly a century later, long sealed and nearly destroyed, reveal coded correspondences between the brothers and secret societies with names that send chills down any researcher's spine. The Black Seraphim, the Silent Choir, the Order of the Veil. These groups weren't mere cults or fraternities, they were architects of control, ancient bloodlines manipulating power behind thrones and governments. The Ravencrofts acted as agents within this web, pioneers who tested methods of absolute domination on a small scale, before those methods were woven into the fabric of modern institutions, law enforcement, military conditioning, even global finance. Their rituals of purification, a prototype for mind control. Their catacombs, early models of secret prisons and black sites. Their doctrine of suffering, the basis for psychological warfare techniques that weaponize pain and obedience. And the hollow flame, not just a metaphor, but a symbol for the all-consuming power of control itself, an entity passed down through generations, masked as salvation, worshipped as truth, but really feeding on the human will. What this means for you, sitting there watching this video, is terrifying and empowering. The forces that sought to break Ravenwood's people haven't disappeared. They've evolved. They lurk in governments, corporations, and social movements disguised as progress and protection. They whisper in algorithms that shape your attention, in education systems that mold your thinking, in narratives that define your identity, and they depend on your silence, on your ignorance, because once the flame touches you, the hollow consumes. But you have a choice now, to remain blind or to become the Firebreaker, to resist the flame, to reclaim your mind and soul. The path is not easy, but it's the only path to true freedom. Now, understand this. The Ravencrofts didn't simply rely on fear and pain to control their flock. They mastered the art of symbolism and psychological imprinting. Symbols weren't just decorations. They were tools of domination. The inverted crosses, spirals carved into floors, the carefully arranged candles, each was designed to embed a subliminal message deep into the subconscious. This is the language of the occult, not in the mystical sense you see in movies, but in the purest form of psychological warfare. Their rituals triggered deep, primal parts of the brain, areas that control fear, pain, and submission. The repetition, the chants, the sensory deprivation, all work together to fracture the mind's defenses. The result? Followers experienced dissociation, a splitting of consciousness, allowing the Ravencrofts to rewrite their identities, almost like corrupting a hard drive. Many reported visions and auditory hallucinations during rituals, which the brothers framed as divine communication. But these were induced states, carefully engineered to deepen dependence on the cult's narrative. Even those who escaped later struggled with psychological scars so deep they resembled modern PTSD. This manipulation was never accidental. It was science disguised as faith. And it worked because it preyed on the human need for meaning. When people suffer and don't understand why, they will clutch at any explanation, no matter how dark or twisted. The Ravencrofts offered answers to the unanswerable, hope in despair, order in chaos. And that's the trap. Because once you accept the narrative imposed on you, once you internalize their symbols and stories, you're no longer in control of your mind. You become a vessel, a carrier of their will. This is why you see the same symbols, the same narratives, the same psychological tactics repeated in powerful organizations today, whether in politics, religion, or corporations. They are the echoes of Duskmoor's darkness. The question is, will you recognize the symbols when they appear in your life? Will you see the spiral before it tightens around you? Or will you become another lost soul buried beneath the floorboards? By the 1840s, the Ravencroft brothers had transformed Ravenwood into a fortress of fear and control, but their ambitions reached far beyond the dense forests of upstate New York. Their doctrines, rituals, and methods weren't meant to stay hidden in one forgotten town. No, they aimed to spread the hollow flame, to ignite a contagion of submission that could be replicated across the continent and beyond. They began recruiting emissaries, carefully selected, fiercely loyal followers dispatched to cities and frontier outposts. These emissaries were tasked with founding new churches of purification, sowing the seeds of torment and control under the guise of salvation. What's chilling is how successful they were. Records show a disturbing pattern. Towns where these emissaries arrived would soon experience unexplained disappearances, outbreaks of fear, and rising devotion to harsh, punishing doctrines. Communities once vibrant became shadows of themselves, like puppets dancing to a tune no one could hear but the masters behind the flame. This was psychological contagion, a virus of the mind. And it worked because it preyed on the vulnerable, those aching for meaning, for purpose, for an escape from their suffering. Through brutal rituals and subtle conditioning, the flame spread silently, leaving behind shattered wills and hollowed souls. What's more terrifying, many descendants of these churches still exist today. Their names changed, their faces masked by time, but their core methods, the ladder, the spiral, the trials, remain eerily consistent. It's not just history, it's a living nightmare. And here's the truth few dare to say aloud. The same networks that backed the Ravencrofts helped lay the groundwork for modern systems of control, from oppressive cults to authoritarian governments, from corporate oligarchies to digital surveillance empires. You might think you're immune because you're not in a remote village or a church basement. But these forces don't discriminate. They adapt, they infiltrate, and they use the same tools to bind you. The question is, will you see the flame before it consumes you? Will you break the cycle, or become another shadow in the catacombs? The true horror of the Ravencroft legacy isn't just what they did, it's what they taught others to do. They perfected a system of institutional manipulation so effective it transcended generations and geography. At its core, it's a blueprint for transforming communities into instruments of control, where loyalty is manufactured through fear, pain, and psychological bondage. They built a hierarchy that rewarded compliance and punished dissent, not just physically but socially and spiritually. Those who questioned the doctrine were branded heretics, ostracized, or worse, disappeared without a trace. This system thrives on invisible chains, forged by guilt, shame, and the crushing weight of isolation. It's the ultimate weapon against free will. Look closely at many of today's power structures, corporate offices, political parties, even social media platforms, and you'll find echoes of the Ravencroft strategy, rules that enforce conformity, surveillance disguised as security, narratives constructed to suppress critical thought, peer pressure that enforces obedience. This is not coincidence, it is design, and it feeds on our primal fear of exclusion, our need to belong. Those who master these systems wield power that transcends money and weapons. They control hearts and minds. This is why the Church of the Pure Spirit was more than a cult. It was an early model of modern control society, a dark seed planted in the fertile ground of desperation and faith. And if you think you're safe now, ask yourself how much of your reality is shaped by invisible hands pulling strings. How much of your identity is molded by unseen rituals and symbols repeated endlessly in culture, media, and politics? The answer may terrify you. But here's the key to breaking free. Awareness is the first act of rebellion. Seeing the chains is the first step to breaking them. When you start seeing the world through the Ravencroft lens, everything changes. The symbols, the stories, the rituals, they're no longer mere superstition or folklore. They become tools of a system designed to consume your will and replace it with obedience. The hollow flame isn't just a metaphor, it's a mechanism, feeding on pain, submission, and fear, growing stronger as it consumes identity. The brothers' writings speak of it not as evil, but as necessary. A crucible through which the weak are burned away, leaving only the pure to rise. This twisted ideology justifies atrocities not as sins, but as sacrifices. They believed that by breaking their followers, they were saving them. But in reality, they were creating chains forged in suffering, chains that outlast flesh and bone. And here's the chilling truth. Many who escape the church remain trapped in its grip, their minds scarred, their identities fractured. Their trauma was weaponized to keep them silent, to keep them loyal to a cause they no longer understood. This is how the Ravencrofts maintained power, through an invisible web of psychological control woven from trauma, fear, and blind faith. It's a system that doesn't rely on brute force alone, but on the slow erosion of self. And that erosion continues today in countless forms. From cults to corporations, from political movements to social media echo chambers. Wherever obedience is prized over freedom, the hollow flame flickers. This is not just history, it's a warning. A call to awaken, to resist the mechanisms that seek to control your mind and spirit. Because once you're caught in the spiral, breaking free is a battle unlike any other. But it starts with knowledge, with truth, with seeing the flame for what it really is. By this point you might wonder, how did such a darkness persist for decades without outside intervention? The answer lies in complicity, the silent consent of those who chose ignorance over confrontation. Ravenwood was isolated, yes, but that alone didn't conceal the horrors. Neighbors heard screams in the night. Some saw people dragged into the forest, never to return. But fear silenced witnesses. Fear of reprisal, fear of damnation, fear of losing everything to a force that promised salvation. This is the weaponization of community. When loyalty becomes a cage and belonging demands sacrifice, people will look away from evil, even commit evil themselves, to protect their place inside. This is why institutional corruption thrives, not just in forgotten towns like Ravenwood, but everywhere power is unchecked and secrets are protected. Those at the top manipulate narratives, bury inconvenient truths, and pit us against each other. They teach us to fear the outsider, to distrust the whistleblower, to worship the system that binds us. And the more we comply, the stronger the chains become. The Ravencroft brothers were masters not just of ritual, but of fear politics. They controlled minds by controlling what people dared to see and say. The sealed federal records, the destroyed evidence, the rewritten histories, all were tools to maintain their grip. And this is the lesson for today. When institutions demand your silence, question why. When they tell you some truths are dangerous, ask who benefits. When they urge you to trust blindly, remember Ravenwood, because the cost of silence is freedom itself. To fight this darkness, we must break the cycle of complicity. Speak truth, seek knowledge, demand accountability. Only then can the hollow flame be extinguished. As the shadows lengthen over Duskmoor, it becomes clear that the Ravencroft legacy is not just a dark chapter in history, but a living force shaping our world today. The psychological chains forged in those catacombs have evolved into sophisticated systems of control. Mass media narratives that divide, corporate cultures that demand conformity, social platforms engineered to manipulate attention and belief. These modern mechanisms echo the same tactics of isolation, confusion, and submission perfected by the brothers centuries ago. Behind polished facades of progress and freedom lurks a more insidious design, one that consumes identity and replaces it with obedience. But knowledge is the weapon that shatters the spell. By understanding the roots of this darkness, the origins of the hollow flame, you arm yourself with the power to resist, to step off the spiral, to reclaim your autonomy, and that resistance begins within. Because the greatest battlefield is not outside but inside the mind, where self-doubt, fear, and false narratives wage war against your true self. It's a war you can win, but only if you recognize the enemy and refuse to kneel. The families like the Ravencrofts sought to bury truth beneath centuries of silence and suffering, but now the silence is breaking, the buried truths are rising, and with them comes a choice: remain a shadow beneath the floorboards, or stand in the light of your own awareness. This is your moment, your crucible, to either be consumed by the flame or become its breaker. This is the final truth I will share with you, a truth so heavy it changes everything. The hollow flame is not just an external force imposed by others, it's also a reflection of the darkness inside each of us, the parts we refuse to face, the pain we bury, the wounds we ignore. The Ravencroft brothers understood this deeply. Their rituals, their purification through suffering, were designed to mirror our internal battles, our struggle with fear, pride, and weakness. But in their hands, that mirror became a prison. And that is the ultimate lesson of Duskmoor. True freedom is not found by submitting to external torment or blind faith. It is found by confronting the shadows within, by walking into your own darkness without fear, by refusing to let the flame consume your spirit. Because the hollow flame feeds on avoidance, denial, and silence. When you name your fears, own your pain, and stand in your truth, the flame loses its power. You become the Firebreaker. Not because you destroy the flame, but because you refuse to be burned by it. You carry the light forged in darkness. The darkness that once buried a family in silence now becomes the soil where your own strength grows. This is the transformation the Ravencroft brothers never anticipated. A man awakened, unbroken, and free. Remember this as you walk your path. The shadows will come, but you hold the power to rise beyond them. This is your legacy, your battle, your victory. Thank you for descending into the secrets of Duskmoor. May the hollow flame reveal your true strength, not your destruction.